Fear is often an interesting paradox. We can often describe how we feel when we're afraid, but it's difficult to explain why we're afraid. Fear is about survival, our mind's desperate attempt to keep us alive. But when we have the opportunity to think about fear, it's this cloudy melancholy, a feeling we don't often want to relive in its full detail. Fear is not an entirely negative emotion. Because fear is so tightly linked with our survival, it's a feeling that reminds us that we're alive. It's based on our perception, our experience, our knowledge. It's so personal that it reminds us that we, as we are, exist. Which is why it's important to understand fear and its applications in storytelling and gaming. So myself, along with Dead Palette, have decided to take a look into what brought fear into the forefront, Resident Evil. Now with that said, some fair warnings. Fear is often violent and unnerving, and this video contains scenes of explicit violence and gore. And it might contain a few jump scares and disturbing imagery. So if you start to feel afraid, remember, it's just a video. Resident Evil is a game that is synonymous with survival horror, directed by Shinji Mikami and produced by Capcom. On March 22, 1996, Resident Evil released in North America and defined a genre. It was a game that no console gamer in the West had ever experienced before. Capcom's new franchise wasn't just an attempt to modernize a 2D game into a 3D playstyle, nor was it simply a power fantasy where you fought against endless hordes of horrifying creatures. It was a game where you were outnumbered, attempting to survive against all odds. A game intentionally designed to kill you, make you feel hopeless. It was a game designed to scare you. And it was exactly what gamers wanted. Resident Evil became an amazing success by critics and consumers, the original selling over 5 million copies, and the director's cut adding another 4 million, becoming one of the best-selling PlayStation games in the console's history. A major feat from a director who, until then, had only worked on a handful of Game Boy games and designed Goof Troop and Aladdin on the Super Nintendo. But while Resident Evil was more than happy to take credit for creating the genre, the truth is, it has a lot of bodies buried in its basement.
Many consider Resident Evil to be the first survival horror game. Some point to Alone in the Dark, which Resident Evil was heavily inspired from. Others point to the game that Resident Evil was conceived as a remake of, Sweet Home, an NES game based off the Japanese movie of the same name. While it's nebulous at best due to the primitive technology used at the time, I'd push survival horror back to 1980 with the release of Missile Command. The game is about survival, and even with its simplistic graphics, can induce feelings of horror. At least it did for me when I first played it. The programmer for Missile Command, David Thurer, even had nightmares of nuclear blast hitting California while designing the game.
The notion of survival and horror was never an alien concept to video games. The limited install base of personal computers at the time prevented many from experiencing games like Alone in the Dark, and the drought of truly scary games was more due to strict censorship from Nintendo that prevented games like Sweet Home and Clock Tower from coming to the West. Even D, a horror game developed by the late Kenji Eno, predated Resident Evil's US release by a month. Sony, however, only produced 28,000 copies of the game that was expected to sell over 100,000, making D's exposure significantly less than Capcom's entry into survival horror. Resident Evil defining a genre had more to do with it being at the right place at the right time. This isn't just an attempt to drag Resident Evil's name through the dirt. Part of retrospection isn't just about wearing nostalgia goggles and not thinking about the wonderful times you had. It's also about accepting the flaws as well as the strengths. Sometimes it's about looking through your memories and noticing something you've never seen. It's about accepting your thoughts, even if it upsets you. It's about accepting the thoughts you desperately try to put aside.
Gesamtkunstwerk. A Gesamtkunstwerk is a piece of art that uses different art forms, all working in chorus. The music, the sound, the visuals, the controls, story, the characters, gameplay, all of it working together. Resident Evil is not a Gesamtkunstwerk. The original version of Resident Evil was and is a great game. It showed how horror could be approached in a 3D video game. But allow me to state the obvious because it seems we need to be reminded of it. The designers of Resident Evil didn't set out to create the genre we now call survival horror. They set out to make a horror-themed game like Alone in the Dark. They were ambitious, but not all of their choices were deliberate or even sound. Much has already been said about the live-action opening to Resident Evil 1996, as well as the piss-poor voice acting. The dialogue is awful, and the story itself isn't much better, but let's ignore quality of dialogue and story to ask questions about its essence. Does the dialogue, in its delivery, as well as the story, match the mechanics of the game? No! No, it doesn't. That, I think, is the bigger problem. The introduction paints the STARS members as action heroes. The dialogue has a sense of levity to it.
You were almost a Jill sandwich.
When characters part ways, there's no sense of urgency or panic in most cases.
Yeah.
With a few notable exceptions, no one is really afraid.
Lost courage already? It's not like you.
And the loss of a team member isn't treated with much dignity.
Hope this is not Chris's blood.
Follow me here. We have in total Resident Evil, Resident Evil Director's Cut, Resident Evil Remaster, Resident Evil Deadly Silence, Umbrella Chronicles, and finally, Resident Evil Remaster HD. That's 6 attempts to turn this landmark game from a mishmash of discordant horror tropes and bad acting into a streamlined, atmospheric experience worthy of its initial discoveries in the genre it arguably invented. Fast forward to Silent Hill, a game looking to capitalize artistically off the discoveries made with Resident Evil 2 years earlier. Silent Hill was a game that took lessons not just from Resident Evil, but various horror movies and novels, even paintings. Especially paintings. As a result, Silent Hill's game design, visual design, character design, puzzle design, sound and music design, and especially its story, all work in chorus. Silent Hill is a Gesamtkunstwerk. Everything about Silent Hill matches its other pieces. It plays like it looks. It looks like it sounds. It sounds like it plays. Nothing can be added. Nothing can be taken from it. Silent Hill is Silent Hill, and nothing about that should change. Nothing. If Resident Evil invented survival horror or showed what survival horror could be, Silent Hill finalized what a survival horror game is.
That's not to discredit Resident Evil or Shinji Mikami. Resident Evil was flawed just like how every game designed is flawed. Just like how you, the viewer watching this, are flawed. Flawed doesn't mean bad. Flawed does not mean broken. Flawed does not mean worthless. Flawed means flawed. It's looking at those flaws and understanding them is how we improve. Experience and character aren't just words, and they're not just allusions to a gameplay mechanic affecting a story element. It's about improving, but improvement only comes from understanding. So let's start by understanding what survivor horror means. Survival is a pretty redundant term when it comes to describing most games. The goal of most games is to survive. Surviving by defeating enemies, jumping across bottomless pits, and making it to the end goal. But in the genre of survival horror, it has a very unique connotation when it comes to describing the gameplay. Survival becomes a term that outlines an agreement between player and designer, an unspoken acknowledgement that the rules of typical game design don't really apply. When designing a game, it's expected for the designer to give the player everything he would need to succeed. A way to get health, pick up ammo, restock lives, new weapons and upgrades to ensure that the player is never going to place the game in an unwinnable state. But when this trust is violated by the designer, it becomes a point of frustration, and it's often seen as a badly designed game. The survival genre is a willing violation of this pact as part of the challenge. Whatever the player receives is now due to the benevolency of the designer, and the player must survive using the limited health and weapons he receives. If he fires a shot when he doesn't need to, or uses a healing item when he's not that hurt, then that's on the player. He doesn't get a freebie, putting him in a very real possibility of making it to the end of the game and not having enough ammo or health to defeat the final boss, if he even gets that far. Horror would seem like it's fairly self-explanatory as well, but it also has a similar style of violating the unspoken set of expectations between player and designer. But a horror setting is even more difficult to incorporate. Fear is so personal. Every person is afraid of different things. Some of us are afraid of death. Some of us are afraid of spiders or high heights. Some of us are afraid of being alone. With so many different elements, how do you even go about it? How do you bring horror into a video game?
Action is a very clear thing to understand, perceive, and judge in art and media. So is drama, mystery, comedy, and many other things. While questions of quality arise with these kinds of subjects, and opinions vary on how pieces of art stack up against other art pieces in the same genre, none of them have the same problems of language, subjectivity, and diagnostic critique that horror runs into. This is because fear is very personal to people, and it's guarded by the ego trying to handle and understand it. Fear is often irrational, but unlike most positive, irrational emotions like love, fear is something we want to overcome. Much like challenges in life, fear is a bitter medicine we must feel for a sense of fulfillment. Fear is healthy, but we don't know how to interpret our fears very well. Here's just a few problems people run into when talking about horror and fear. A negative mindset can easily prevent someone from feeling fear while enjoying art. The worst thing a blockbuster horror movie can do for me is to say, the most scary movie released this October. The media hype kills my expectations and prevents me from giving a movie a chance to scare me. It's like a reminder that it's not real. Some of the most powerful fears, for most people, affect others the least. So while the fear of the unknown is the most powerful fear for most people, it doesn't do much for me other than flavor a piece of art. fear of the unknown is certainly the most intellectual fear to me, but not scary. Horror is a genre of art that uses fear as a key or even primary ingredient. But horror is more than just fear. Horror can deal with the unknown, the strange, the unexplainable, the gruesome, the insanity of beliefs, and the inhumanity of humans. To judge a piece of horror on how much it can scare you is to ignore a giant portion of what it's attempting to do. Resident Evil is much more than an anachronistic mansion full of zombies. It's the unknown aspect of Bravo Team's disappearance, the strange nature of the architecture and paintings, the unexplainable invulnerability of Lisa Trevor and the Tyrant, the gruesome sight of your fallen comrades, the insanity of beliefs held by Wesker, and the inhumanity of Spencer when dealing with his employees. Resident Evil isn't a game about fear. It is a horror game. Thus it has fear as an element of it. The fear in Resident Evil is a mechanical fear. It has become such a landmark game because of this. Paintings can capture the visceral nature of fear. Novels can allow the mind to personalize a fear in ways visuals can't. Films can push viewers to feel fear of the inevitable fates of its characters. But until Resident Evil 1996, no video game had discovered what unique techniques the medium could offer horror and fear.
A good horror game uses this fear against you, putting you against enemies you're completely powerless to stop, using camera angles and shadows to obscure enemies you have every right to see. It uses fear to give you a feeling of slight tension in your stomach as you walk through the hall, to that panic scream forcing your way through your body as terror overcomes you. But fear isn't about the panic of being taken by surprise. It can just as easily be mundane. It's learning how to make you afraid of the things that aren't scary. It's about planting a seed in your mind and allowing it to consume your thoughts, making you doubt your environment, your expectations, and most of all, doubt yourself. Combining survival and horror does so much to spit in the face of traditional game design. It's not a power fantasy, it often doesn't make you feel satisfied, and it dares you to keep playing despite how miserable it can make you feel. To create a successful survival horror game, you must first know how to design a game well, just so you can purposely make the game bad, only to make it bad in such a way that the game is actually genius. If the original Resident Evil had a misstep in any direction, there is a distinct possibility we would not be talking about the genre or series right now. The original Resident Evil is flawed, but that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's even deserving of being called the first survival horror game. It doesn't matter if the game would even hold up by today's standards. Almost despite itself, Resident Evil managed to accomplish so much on a level of whatever praise it received, it deserved. That's what matters. But survival horror didn't stop there. As with any medium, it had its opportunity to grow and evolve, drawing upon experience to further perfect the genre. And Capcom takes every opportunity it can to milk a franchise, so it comes to no surprise that there would be sequels and revisions. Resident Evil 2 was an attempt to take survivor horror into a more familiar setting with players, showing the aftermath of the events at the mansion as the T-Virus had taken its toll over the entirety of Raccoon City. Hideki Kamiya would direct, with Shinji Mikami now acting as a producer. The new setting would have a focus on action and atmosphere, with a police station replacing the mansion. The original concept, now commonly known as Resident Evil 1.5, would be around 80% complete, but since the game failed to meet Mr. Mikami's expectations, they decided to restart the project using what they have learned. To apologize for the delay, Capcom released Resident Evil Director's Cut, which featured new modes including an arranged mode, which was designed for those who had played the original, and re-added content that was removed from the Western release of Resident Evil, though some scenes were still censored as part of a localization error. In January 1998, nearly 2 years after the release of the original Resident Evil, Capcom released Resident Evil 2, coming into both critical and commercial success. Though the basic premise was the same, it featured an interesting mechanic called the zapping system, which allowed you to experience the story from two separate perspectives, with the actions of one playthrough affecting the other. Shortly after, Resident Evil 3 and Resident Evil Code Veronica were being developed around the same time, with Resident Evil 3 being released on September 1999 and Code Veronica released 5 months later on the Dreamcast. Though critically and commercially successful, these two titles failed to come close to the sales of Resident Evil and Resident Evil 2. It seemed as if franchise fatigue was setting in with consumers. So in a desperate attempt to keep the series relevant, Capcom continued to push Resident Evil titles, including the infamous Resident Evil Survivor. Originally designed as a light gun supported first-person shooter, the recent events of the Columbine shooting caused Capcom to remove the GunCon support from the American release, resulting in a very poor first-person shooter experience. The game sold poorly and is often considered the worst game in the series by far. The series' affair with the portable market didn't fare well either. Resident Evil Gaiden, a non-canon game featuring Barry Burton and Leon S. Kennedy, failed to generate much interest with the critics. It became clear that Capcom didn't have much planned for Resident Evil as a long-term series, and Mikami himself stated that, "Fear is a stimulation. When people get used to it, it's not scary anymore. If you create the series after 4 or 5 years, a new generation will play, so you shouldn't make a lot of the series in a short time."
There's never been a clear direction for the Resident Evil series, as showcased not only by its origins as a 3D version of Sweet Home, the ongoing creative disagreements of artists involved with the series, and its discordant debut entry, but also the numerous games that have begun development as Resident Evil titles, only to spin off into new series for Capcom. For instance, Dino Crisis was designed by the same team that developed Resident Evil and borrowed many gameplay design choices from it, while offering customization options for weapons and an increased focus on combat. The decision of flee or fight was caused by entering the stationary Weaver police stance in Resident Evil. This was abandoned in Dino Crisis for the ability to aim and move at the same time. Likewise, the graphics are shifted from straight survival horror to more of an action aesthetic. As a result, the high fidelity and focus on interesting atmospheric environments, utilizing pre-rendered image graphics, was dropped in favor of real-time 3D modeled geometry. Dino Crisis plays up, intentionally or unintentionally, the kitschy B-movie aspects of Resident Evil.
That's disgusting.
With the development of Resident Evil 2, Shinji Mikami and colleague Hideki Kamiya ran into creative differences. Mikami-san saw the value of Resident Evil as a horror game, while Kamiya wanted to push Resident Evil further into the action genre to emulate American action flicks. Yoshiki Okamoto also disliked Mikami's idea of having Resident Evil 2 be the conclusion of the franchise, a battle of auteur visions clashing. The development of Resident Evil 4 was led by Kamiya-san and produced by Mikami-san. When the protagonist became too much of an action hero, the camera angles became modernized, and the nature of the combat turned stylish, Mikami wisely realized Kamiya wasn't making a Resident Evil game anymore. As a result, Resident Evil 4 became Devil May Cry. The released version of Resident Evil 4 consumers got was written and directed by Mikami. While it was certainly more palatable to most consumers than previous entries, the survival horror elements adored by fans returned in a big way. If you're not convinced that Resident Evil wasn't always going to be a straight survival horror game, and how could you not be at this point? I think we've empirically shown it. Did you know it was initially conceived as an FPS, but was dropped in favor of the game that we got because it wasn't up to snuff?
It seemed like survival horror was on a clear path, a path that neither had a focus on survival or horror. There are fingers that could be pointing at many reasons why. The attempt to appeal to a broader audience, the pressure from a publisher to constantly create more spin-offs and sequels, the artistic vision of directors not following the source material closely, or simply how the zombie fell apart. But there was one person who wanted to take survival and horror back.
Orwell E. Spencer, also referred to as Lord Spencer, was the president of Umbrella, a major bioweapons manufacturer hiding behind a pharmaceutical facade. A man of great wealth and power, he was an aristocrat with a keen hobby in art collecting. He had a vision to remake the world and lead it into a new era, as the world's current state was less than ideal to Lord Spencer. He intended to use the research of bioorganic weapons to carry out his vision and mold a utopia for mankind, with himself as its ruler. As Lord Spencer was backstabbing Umbrella higher-ups and conspiring to reform the world, he commissioned well-known architect George Trevor to design a special mansion in the Arklay Mountains, which was completed in 1967. This mansion, the Spencer Estate, held many secrets, but these secrets were largely known and understood by Mr. Trevor. Mr. Trevor and his family were invited to live at this mansion, and a sad story would unfold because Mr. Trevor knew too much. Wesker would seem to be the antagonist by the end of the events of Resident Evil 1, when in point of fact, the Spencer Estate itself is the biggest threat. The monsters and traps are both the biggest threats and the most robust horrors the game has on offer. Spencer, by way of creating this mansion, is the biggest antagonist. But Spencer didn't create this mansion, did he? And I'm not referring to George Trevor either. Shinji Mikami made this mansion. He is our unseen enemy. Let's learn about our antagonist.
Shinji Mikami, as stated previously, started at Capcom as a planner, or a game designer who typically doesn't have a lot of experience. But he proved he was more than capable of designing games, which eventually landed him jobs at Capcom as a director, producer, and eventually general manager. Now at 49 years old, he claims to serve a more advisory role, but at a certain point in his career, he was only going home 2 days a week while working on his games. Shinji Mikami is known for his eccentricism, his passion for his projects, and being a stickler for quality, having scrapped 4 concepts of Resident Evil 4 because they failed to meet his expectations. He also walked out midway through negotiations with Microsoft as they had no answer for their vision of how they viewed video games. And he would eventually leave Capcom to start his own company, but that's a story for another time. After years of experience with working in survival horror, Shinji Mikami never felt satisfied with the original Resident Evil. The limitations of the hardware and his inexperience accumulated into a game which he was proud of, but the nagging feeling that he could do better. So, in late 1999, he petitioned Capcom to allow him to recreate Resident Evil on the upcoming next-gen consoles. Resident Evil Rebirth, as it would be known throughout development, wasn't just a standard port or even what we would call an HD remake. It was built from the ground up, using the original only as a blueprint. Shinji Mikami made it a point not to waste a single ounce of power out of the GameCube, creating a game that was visually breathtaking and terrifying. featuring a redesigned mansion with dynamic lighting, a much darker atmosphere, a remastered soundtrack, and many other changes that made the game look and feel better. The gameplay was overhauled as well, from the new defensive weapons and redesigned puzzles to things I won't spoil quite yet. There's a lot to talk about. There's far more to be discussed about the Resident Evil remake and survival horror in general, but this was only meant to whet your appetite for things to come. The original Resident Evil makes for a great case study for survival horror, and it's always important to know where you've been to know where you're going. But the remake is where we'll learn exactly how far the genre can take us. But for now, as we wait for the main course, let's allow what's in our minds and our stomachs to digest. What lies ahead of us in that mansion in the distance? What kind of terror waits behind those heavy oak doors? Is it something truly terrifying? Or is it just something our minds blow out of proportion? There's only one way to find out. So be sure to join us next time as we step through that door and enter a world of true survival horror. This is SoberDwarf with Dead Palette, reminding you that gaining experience
builds spirit.
Lost courage already? It's not like you.
Hey, thanks for watching my video. This is part 1 of a 2-part series I'm doing on Resident Evil. If you want to see the second part the day it releases, remember to subscribe if you haven't already. I know I usually make a joke about it, but it really does help me out as well. An extra special thanks to Dead Palette, who contributed his amazing vocal talents, insights, and disturbing cinematography. If you can't wait for part 2, check out his channel where he does a lot of narration of scary stories and analysis.